All right. Hello, everyone. I'm Sheilagh O'Brien. I'm the church historian and also the registrar here at St Francis College. So if you're interested in tertiary study, please come and see me and we can make a time to meet and sort out what you'd like to study. But in the meantime, this week I'm doing a mini lecture and I tried to pick something that hopefully would be a little bit fun, a little bit naughty, a little bit exciting maybe, but also something that is very relevant to how we think about ourselves today and how we think about history as being something that's very far away. I think we're all familiar with that phrase, history is another country, they do things differently there. It distances us from people in the past, from the decisions that they made, the ideas that they had, and it allows us to be, I think, very judgmental. Oh, we're different from them, we're better than them, we've sorted this stuff out. We would never do the things that they did then. And I think the moment that we distance ourselves from other people in the past, we lose the thread of humanity that goes throughout our history, and we lose the idea that those who lived then shared many of the same fears and dreams and hopes that we did within a different understanding of the world, or a different cosmology, we might say. So my topic today is the Carnival over? Which is a bit of a joke based on a song my mum likes, which is called The Carnival is Over. It's a lovely folk song if you're familiar. So that's my personal pun. But the Reformation of popular culture. The Reformation of popular culture was a very hot topic about 40 years ago in history circles, and it sort of died down a little bit. And I sort of want to revive it as thinking about popular culture being who we are or what we are and how we view one another's cultural contexts. So when we say carnival, we often think of something quite fun, right? We think, oh, party? Let's go to Venice, let's put on a fancy outfit, have a gondola ride. We might think of Rio de Janeiro, we might think of samba dancing and a good time. But carnivals can have a darker or more disturbing side. And in the medieval and early modern period during Lent, carnival could also be known as charivari. There were also events called skimmington rides, which we're going to talk a little bit more about in a moment. And it could also lead to competitions between different towns and villages, which included armed raids, sometimes some acts of violence, and something called rough music. So when we think about this term carnival, when we think about joyous and enjoyable celebration, I also want us to think about how that can go wrong. And in the medieval and early modern period, sometimes that going wrong was built into the recipe of a carnival. A carnival involved a release of social constraints and an ability to go wild. So these carnivals could be enacted as mob violence and cleansings of the community. And when we think about carnival, it occurs at a very specific time in the liturgical calendar. It occurs during Lent. Just before that moment of Lent, just on Shrovetide, is when you have your carnival. So if there's someone in your community who has been acting in ways you find morally reprehensible, this is an excellent time to cleanse that person and their actions within your community. So that purification, sometimes related to the term charivari, could be fueled by the inebriation and the sort of celebration of the carnival, but it might also be very calculated. It might be planned in advance by members of the community who wanted to send a message about what should or shouldn't happen. And what we have here is a medieval or early modern, in this case, charivari, where they've organised an actual procession to shame members of the community for their behaviour, and they've turned up at the house and they've got someone riding a donkey backwards and they've forced them into this public display of shame. We think of these traditions as being ancient. We might think of them as being far, far in the past. But in 1940, there's a really interesting account of a woman from Oxford called Miss Eltenton. In 1940 in Oxford, people were being placed with other people in the community. So a young woman from the Foreign Office, who's called Miss C in this account to hide her identity, was sent to live with Miss Eltenton in her home in Oxford. Now Miss C had a rather odd habit, we might say. She tended to leave the windows wide open and the shades wide open while she got changed in the morning and evening. And this led to a lot of talk in the local community. And eventually one morning, Miss Eltenton wakes up and there's a sound of banging. And the local community are doing something called rough music, where they get everything they can use to make loud noise and they march to the house of the person that they regard as morally reprehensible, and they do rough music. So they bang on saucepans, they chant, they yell, they carry on, and they do this as an act of public shaming of this young woman. Now, Miss Tenton doesn't say what time of year this happened, but I'd be very interested to know if it happened just before Lent. But what happens in this case, because it's in a modern setting, well, a policewoman turns up, sits them down and goes, what's been happening? What's going on? Lots of concerns. What kind of immoral behaviour has been happening in this house? Because the locals are saying that it's been happening. And eventually they're allowed to go free and there's no consequences for them. Of course, police being a very modern phenomenon, this would not have been the case in the medieval or early modern period. So indeed, the use of rough music, like this case, or of skimmington rides, where someone would be forced onto a donkey, potentially a horse or a donkey with an outfit sometimes put on them, sometimes their pants were put on their head, and they're put on the donkey or the horse, and they'd be ridden backwards through town, and things that we might best not wish to speak about from chamber pots would often be thrown on them, just to make the absolute message clear. You have shamed our community, you have acted in a way that we find reprehensible, and we want to make a statement about that. So this mocking, either of members of the community who had done wrong, could also be part of a wider mocking of society itself. So within carnivals, there are these two sort of competing parts. There is a mocking of social structures, sometimes of the very mores that they're using in other circumstances, and the mocking of particular people in particular times and places for their misdeeds. So this whole concept comes into focus when we think about it within that medieval and early modern time period. In 1618, just over 400 years before Miss Tenton's experience, a young, she was in her 30s, I think that's young because I'm in my 30s, but she appears to have been in her 30s or 40s, a woman had this same sort of process done against her. People came, in this case, from a neighbouring village. They had heard that this young woman, Agnes Mills, was apparently contentious, and even worse, she dominated her husband. Ooh, shocking. And because of that, they actually came twice in one day. First, a small group came to the town in the morning and said, we're going to Agnes Mills' house and we're banging our pots and saucepans. And the local neighbours actually said, no, go away. So they defended Agnes and her husband, and they forced them back. And then around noon, the group came back again. And this is the account from her husband of what was done to her. About noon came again from Calm to Kemmerford another drummer named William Wyatt, and with him 300 or 400 men, some like soldiers armed with pieces and other weapons, and a man riding upon a horse, having a white nightcap upon his head, 2 shoeing horns hanging by his ears, a counterfeit beard upon his chin made of a deer's tail, a smock upon the top of his garments, and on it goes. And that description of his clothing is very important, because part of the rituals around Carnival and Charivari had to do with dressing in rather outrageous fashion. And sometimes it had to do with dressing in ways that actually countered what might be considered normal and appropriate. So there are all these ways in which this carnival, this Charivari, this skimmington ride, this rough music is doing multiple kinds of inversion and controversion of social norms, which is rather interesting for something that actually is aiming to punish people for contravening social mores. Eventually, she is actually pulled out of her house, and according to the historian Martin Ingram, what followed is what we would describe as a home invasion and a sort of an assault on this woman, Agnes Mills. Stones were thrown at her windows, an entry forced, and Agnes Mills was dragged out of the house, thrown in a wet hole, trampled, beaten, and covered with mud and filth. Her tormentors, however, failed in their final object of riding her behind the horseman to Cowan to wash her in the cucking stool. Instead, her husband managed to get through, pull her out, and eventually brought charges against the people he thought were responsible, including his landlord, for this act of violence against his wife. But my question is, how do we comprehend or understand such acts of violence? In England alone, there were 3 different regional names for this very kind of ritualized public humiliation. In the southwest, it was called a skimmington ride. In the north, it was riding the stang, and more generally, it might be described as a riding. Targets usually included scolding women in particular, but they might also include men who had committed adultery, landlords who overtaxed their tenants in terms of the increases in rents, and a whole range of different people for misbehaviour or misdemeanour that people found unacceptable within the community. According to Ingram, these kinds of charivaris could vary considerably in scale. So some were just a few people turning up with pots and pans to say, we disapprove of your behaviour. Others could include hundreds of people, and there are records of these going all the way through into the 19th and even the 20th century. So how do we consider these kinds of acts within a notion that we have gradually been changing towards what we might call a more civilised society, in which public and mob violence is no longer acceptable? Of course, I'm talking here about a very specific period, about the time between essentially the Black Death and the Enlightenment, a time during which there was a great deal of structure to society, but during which there was no such thing as a police force that you could call up to complain about something, and there was nobody you could ring up to make a complaint about your landlord changing your rents at the last minute. There was no RTO. So how do we think about this period and how it impacted on these behaviours? In this late medieval and early modern period, as I said at the beginning, there was this idea brought out by the social historians of the 1970s that there was a real change or reformation of popular culture. Their concept was that popular culture, which we might think of as working class, or in Australia maybe you might say ochre culture, diverges from proper culture, opera, and going to the theatre. There's very up there, and we're down here. And this idea that as those two diverge, you get changing mores and changing structures, and that as they continue to diverge, people in power create more and more structures like police, like various government agencies, to control and police morality in a different way. So instead of there being control measures from below, you get many more control measures from above. So this is this sort of concept from the social historians of the 1970s, people like E.P. Thompson and Lyndall Roper. To some extent, they may have a point. But I have a different question in mind. Instead of thinking of it as a structural issue about how structures change, because that's very much from a Marxist social history perspective, I want to ask a different question, which is what happened to the people who wanted to do this? Where are they now? How might we reconsider the ways in which history doesn't change rather than the ways that it does? We might no longer ride someone who's a henpecked husband backwards on a horse, but I think as a society we do have methods of control. So celebrations like Shrovetide and Lent, May Day, Michaelmas and Christmas, which could all have been marked in the 16th and 17th centuries by violence, like groups of armed men moving from one village to another, occupying the local pub in the neighbouring town, and sometimes even taking the priest hostage until they got beer. We don't do that anymore. Well, most of the time we don't. We don't have a Shrove Tuesday riot anymore, which was very common in the 17th century in London. In London, there were many, many thousands, up to 20,000 apprentices in the 17th century in London. And every Shrove Tuesday, when you're enjoying your pancakes, I want you to think about the experience. There were 26 Shrove Tuesdays in the 17th century, which ended in apprentice riots in London. And the particular target of these riots were brothels and prostitutes. And the most famous of these being the 1668 Shrove Tuesday riot, which resulted in one of my favourite documents, the Poor Whores Petition. This is a petition written by the brothel keepers of London to the King's mistress, saying, well, you are the most famous whore in the country, can you not save us? And obviously it's meant as a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but to be fair, the King did send soldiers into London because this riot lasted for 4 days. So he had to eventually send soldiers in to actually protect the brothels and send the apprentices back to their jobs. Where are these people gone? How might we re-understand these? Well, we might re-understand it as well in that these methods of protest and dislike of authority came out in different ways. For example, in 1607, the Bishop of Bath and Wells, who wasn't even that unpopular, was publicly mocked in a charivari where they dressed someone up as him and rode that person round on a donkey for a little bit and sort of made fun and had a little passion play, but it wasn't a passion play, about all the things he did wrong because he wasn't a very good bishop. He wasn't even that bad, but certainly they didn't like him. Where did all of this go, this passion about saying something about something in the public sphere? We might think that it actually finds different kinds of outlets. We have one thing that happens from a sort of middle class perspective, which is the Reformation of manners society that arises in London. And often this has been pointed to as, well, this fixed the problem with charivari. But it never really gets that far off the ground, and it's really more on the side of the apprentices of Shrove Tuesdays than it is on the side of anyone else. It wants to close brothels and stop any kind of lustful acts on the streets. It's also got a little bit of a problem with coffee at one point, which, let's not go there, don't touch my coffee. But inside that Reformation of manners, people have often said, well, this is what happened to the public satires of the medieval and early modern period. But I want to raise a different question. Perhaps it changed not in essence, but in form. And the rise of new medias possibly gave different opportunities for people to state their dislike of different institutions. So in the 1840s, you have Punch being published for the first time, which I think rather delightfully has the subtitle London Charivari. Here are some 21st century political cartoons from Australia. I love the chicken crossing the road and the police saying, now, this better be good. You better have one of the coronavirus approved reasons for being out, chicken. And then you've got an Australian Gothic. And there is another group that I think embodies some of these charivari notions, which is groups like Anonymous or groups on Twitter. And we often behave as though these are new phenomenons, as though people have never banded together in large groups to criticize people in power or people whose morality they disagree with, or people that they don't accept as being part of the in-group. I would argue human nature hasn't changed. Perhaps our methods for expressing our feelings have changed. It's not as though we have lost the urge to mock and ridicule and humiliate those we regard as out of our bounds of our moral behaviour. Many people engage in a lot of sort of hand-wringing and pearl clutching and distress over Twitter trolls and this and that and say, well, this is new. I say, no, this isn't new. This is charivari. This is something as old as human beings themselves. Perhaps it's less a matter of the medium is the message and more that the message itself has changed mediums. We no longer, thankfully, drag women from their house for scolding their husband, beat them and throw them in a mud puddle. That doesn't mean that people who step outside of our particular modern day ideas of what is right and wrong do not themselves get treated very badly, particularly in online forums. So what I want to leave you with is a message that whenever something happens that we don't like, whenever people behave in ways that we don't wish, if you're someone who has a Twitter account and you get that urge to tweet, take a second. What does that mean? What is it that we are doing when we engage in those kinds of debates and when we engage in those kinds of actions? How do we do it in ways that are constructive and are not merely a way of signaling that I am part of the immoral crowd and you will be ridden on the back of a donkey through town for my pleasure and my purification? So I think that's the sort of the end of the talk that I want to leave you with.